So here we are on a Friday night. I have to admit, looking that there is a nice group of people here tonight, that it reminds me back in the late 80s, early 90s, when there was a lot of activism locally among railroad workers, and we were doing some work then with the union that was had been the Brotherhood of Railway and Airline Clerks, and they met on Friday nights, and I went to speak at a union meeting, and I said, why in the world would you have a union meeting on Friday night? And these were mostly women. And I said, you know, don't you want to be home watching Dallas? And one of them said, Professor, haven't you ever heard of a VCR? So it's great to see you all here on a Friday night. If you haven't been here before, I urge you to sign the guest book so that we can add you to our newsletter list and keep you informed about what's going on. And also let you know that there are restrooms downstairs. We're just really glad that you're here. And I think because Michael's here from Pittsburgh and we were talking a little bit about Andrew Carnegie, that I should also say to all of you that we're in a Carnegie library and we should thank the immigrant coal miners and iron miners and steel workers who he exploited all his life, that made him rich and turned him into a philanthropist. And so whether you have an Italian or a Croatian or a Serbian or a Romanian accent, invoke it tonight and think about who paid for this building. So I just want to say a little bit by way of an introduction of Michael Goodhart, that he's a professor of political science, philosophy, and gender studies at the University of Pittsburgh. And there he directs their Global Studies Center. And he's also the president of something called the Global Switchboard, which is a local project that uses a network stewardship model to help make Pittsburgh a more equitable and more globally engaged city. And that seems like the perfect resume to be involved here at the Eastside Freedom Library. So please welcome Michael Goodhart.
Thanks, Peter. I'm really glad to be here. I was invited to give a talk at the university, which I did earlier today, but reached out through some friends and contacts because I wanted to try to do something out in the community also. So thanks for making that possible for me. I'm really happy to be here. And as Peter was saying, you know, I'm conscious of the fact that it's a Friday evening, and we know things are getting dire when a bunch of people show up on a Friday night to hear a stranger talk about how not to save the planet. And so we should just be clear from the start that things are really dire. A recent report from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or IPCC, which is the world's leading authority on climate science, projects 2 degrees Celsius of Earth warming by 2040 and 4 degrees Celsius by the end of the century, if not significantly before. This is being referred to as the Doomsday Report because scientists have for a long time warned about the significant and devastating effects that a 2 degrees Celsius increase in temperatures would have on human, animal, and plant life, and on planetary ecosystems. So today, the best science is actually telling us that catastrophic climate change is literally baked into our near future. The worst case scenarios include surging seas, killer heat waves, intensification of extreme weather, declining food yields, unbreathable air, toxic ocean acidification, and an accelerating mass extinction event. This is the science that led journalist David Wallace-Wells to write last year in the New York Times that it's time to panic. It's worth noting that some scientists have objected to this view. They've objected to Wallace-Wells' 2017 New York Magazine article called The Uninhabitable Earth, and a book by the same name that came out last year. And what they objected to was not so much the science that he was citing, but his decision to focus on worst-case scenarios. Now here I'm with Wallace-Wells. I think it's actually well past time to panic. In the late 1970s, the science of global warming was already well understood. the National Academy of Sciences found it highly credible that doubling the concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere would trigger between 1.5 and 4.5 degrees Celsius of planetary warming. And in fact, we've doubled it relative to the pre-industrial baseline since 1986. So it was time to be worried in 1990 when the IPCC issued its first report, which warned that planetary warming was already underway and likely to continue. It was time to be really worried in 1992 when the UN Earth Summit in Rio failed to establish binding emissions targets or enforcement mechanisms at the behest of the G.H.W. Bush administration. It was probably time to panic in 1997 when the US rejected the Kyoto Accord before it was even negotiated, making it difficult for the treaty to come into effect and basically ensuring that it would be useless in slowing or reversing emissions. It was for sure time in 2009 when the Copenhagen Conference of Parties collapsed, this time with the help of the Obama administration, again without reaching any kind of binding agreement. And it was absolutely time in 2015 when the Paris Agreement set targets that would, if met, lead to roughly 3 degrees Celsius of warming by 2100, more than enough to trigger most of the devastation that I just outlined. And keep in mind that one large emitter has now withdrawn from the Paris Agreement, ensuring that even those targets won't be met. So the Doomsday Report does give us a reason to panic, but we should have been panicking a long time ago. So if you're panicking or thinking about panicking, then you might also be thinking about what you can do to help turn things around. So what I'm going to do tonight is outline 5 familiar strategies that won't work. And I'll explain to you why they won't work, and then I'll tell you what I think could work and what you can maybe do to help save the planet. And just before I get started on that, one thing, I use this terminology, how to save the planet, but like so many of these things, the rhetoric and discourse really matter. The planet's going to be just fine. It's going to be different, but it'll be fine. What we're really talking about is saving ourselves and the plants and the animals with whom we share this fragile and increasingly fraught moment in ecological time. So let's talk about what won't work. The first thing that won't work is business as usual. Now this isn't really even a strategy. As I've just said, things are already bad. And actually, given the way the climate works, things are already worse in the future, because even if emissions ceased completely tomorrow, the planet would keep warming for at least a century. Yet alarmingly, I think business as usual may be the most likely scenario for 2 reasons. The first has to do with what's usual. Has anyone heard of changing baseline syndrome? No? Changing baseline syndrome, a friend of mine calls it cranky old person syndrome. And I'll get back to that, is the idea that we have trouble noticing the effects of climate change and other kinds of historical changes in the environment because every generation naturally treats present conditions as the benchmark against which they assess change. Right? So what seemed to those of us of a certain age to be evidence of increasingly erratic weather just seems to present generations normal. It's the thing they've grown up with, what they've known. So young people today will wholly unconsciously adopt present temperatures, extreme weather, weather variations, wildfires, and the like as their baseline. That will be the normal compared to which things might come to seem abnormal to them in the future. So my friend's comment about cranky old person syndrome is kind of right. It's the old, it used to snow a lot more when I was a kid. I mean, that's actually true, right? The thing is, now we understand more that it was true and why it's so hard for those of us who are not the cranky old person to recognize that. Anyway, changing baseline syndrome is a mechanism that obscures just how unusual things are getting under business as usual. Although the recent and predicted acceleration of warming trends and associated disruptions means that climate change is actually now becoming legible within the span of a single adult lifetime. So, that being true, we nonetheless tend to talk and act as if we still have time to sort things out before climate change will affect us. But we don't. It's happening now, and it's happening faster than scientists anticipated. The second reason why business as usual is likely to be our response is business. Carbon profiteers, ExxonMobil is the most notorious offender, have spent billions of dollars to deny and discredit the research that their own scientists helped to produce. But even many businesses that don't directly deny the science nonetheless resist the measures, like an end to massive government subsidies of fossil fuels or a carbon tax, that could be effective in addressing climate change. And that goes for consumers too. We don't want to pay the costs of averting disaster. So of course, the upshot of that is that we're going to pay more to deal with those disasters later, and there will be more of them, and they'll be worse. This short-sightedness is actually a chronic problem for an economic and financial system that views quarterly profits as the sole measure of success. But the problem's deeper, because that same economic system is actually designed to make many people's lives precarious, so that they fear anything that might threaten their jobs or their retirement accounts. And this is a real problem, this jobs question, and I'm happy to talk about it in the discussion afterwards. But the net result of this is that a carbon tax or the loss of jobs seems panic-inducing, while the impending uninhabitability of the planet does not seem panic-inducing. This is going to make the status quo very, very hard to change. The second way not to save the planet is through personal virtue. And let me just be blunt here. Anything you do individually to reduce your carbon footprint is utterly inconsequential in forestalling climate change. It's not to say you shouldn't do it, but the point is that driving or flying less, eating less meat, turning down the thermostat, installing solar panels, no amount of personal virtue can stop climate change, because climate change is a structural problem. It's built into our economy and built into our way of life. And because it's a structural problem, ironically and perversely, personal virtue can actually be self-defeating. For every mile you don't drive, the essentially undetectable reduction in emissions that results also produces an equally invisible reduction in the demand for and price of gasoline. For every flight you skip, the price of airline tickets goes down just a smidgen, so that collectively the total amount of personal virtue goes up, and the incentives for other people to drive or fly more go up with it. Besides, personal virtue is mainly a luxury for the rich. There's so much fat in our carbon budgets that we can cut a lot out without really changing our lives very much. Again, that's not to say you shouldn't do it. You should. But the main reason you should do it is because we need to learn to think and live differently. And taking these steps is important in that respect. Our economic system demands endless growth and ceaseless exploitation of resources to be converted into stuff that we can buy and sell and consume, including the green stuff that we like to pretend doesn't count. This is a kind of insanity, and it can't be sustained. Now, personal virtue can feel empowering because it gives us a false sense of control. But climate change is out of control, and the only way to get it under control is to address the structural problems that cause it. You can decline as many straws and plastic bags as you want, and again, you should, but Enbridge expects a significant return on the Line 3 expansion project, and it will do everything it can to get it. Every pipeline, every new cracker plant, that's the big issue in Pittsburgh right now where I live, every new oil or gas well locks in another however many years of fossil fuel use that are needed to ensure the profitability of those projects. And so until we begin to shift away from a carbon economy, individual consumer choices will be swamped by structural economic imperatives. Many people avoid panicking by putting their faith in technology. After all, there's smart people working on this. We put a man on the moon. Alexa can tell jokes. Someone will figure it out, right? I don't want to downplay the importance of technology. We're going to need lots of innovation just to stave off the very worst. 100% renewable energy isn't the finish line, it's the starting point of what we need. Given all the carbon and other stuff that we've emitted into the atmosphere, and given the lifespan of those gases, we're going to need massive carbon sequestration technology just to hold down the catastrophic warming that we've already set into motion. And carbon is just one of the issues. As ice melts and snow cover diminishes, the planet's albedo, basically its shininess, decreases, meaning that less radiation gets reflected back into space and more warming happens here. And that initiates feedback loops, the consequences of which we can barely understand, never mind predict. Examples of this are things like the release of methane from the permafrost as it melts, or, God forbid, the shutdown of the Gulf Stream due to changing ocean salinity and whatever. And these are, we don't know exactly what will happen, but it won't be good. Now, some people in response are talking about seeding the atmosphere with various kinds of particles that might deflect solar radiation. So, for instance, injecting sulfur dioxide into the stratosphere would probably lead to the formation of sulfate aerosol particles, and those would increase the albedo and scatter sunlight and thus reflect heat back into space. Now, geoengineers liken this to the effects of a massive volcanic eruption, which somehow is supposed to be reassuring, I guess, because volcanoes are natural or something, so is coronavirus. Anyway, it would limit warming, maybe, but it would also accelerate the acidification of the oceans and further pollute our air and soil. And even if it worked, it would only treat the symptoms while leaving the underlying pathology unaddressed. Now, there are many proposed technological fixes, and each one comes with its own set of limits and risks. People who work in my field, climate ethicists and philosophers and others, end up debating the conditions under which we should consider such approaches. How bad do things have to be? Or what are the most important things to consider? Or who should ultimately weigh the trade-offs and make the final decisions? But to me, the problem is less one of ethics than of ethos, which basically just means the way we think and live. All of these technological solutions smack of the same kind of arrogance and hubris that led to this mess in the first place. They reflect this mentality of mastery over the earth and of nature, which we treat as a system to be exploited for endless profit. I actually find it kind of terrifying to think about the men, and honestly they're mostly men, who are sitting around salivating about all the money they're going to make on these projects, which essentially, and think about this, these projects essentially amount to polluting the atmosphere on purpose to save us from the pollution that we refused to stop emitting long after we knew that we needed to stop emitting it. We need to think differently. Fourth strategy that won't work is awareness and education. Lots of well-meaning people think that awareness and education can solve virtually all of our problems. Once people know whatever it is, they'll do the right thing. So once voters and politicians and policymakers know how bad the problem is, this thinking goes, they'll take the necessary steps to address it. And then that logic runs in both directions. If politicians aren't taking action, it must be because they or their constituents don't know. So, educate. Philosophers have been thinking about this question for a long time. Socrates famously believed that knowledge is virtue, that knowing the good would be enough for people to be good. His student Plato wasn't having it. He described a soul in conflict with rational and spirited and desiring parts, all pulling in different directions. Now, he thought the rational part could and should prevail, but this would require a lot of rigorous training and discipline. When Plato applied this idea to politics, it ended up justifying rule by an elite class of enlightened guardians whose superior knowledge was supposed to guide the sort of benighted classes in the polity. And I find it interesting in this connection that there's a surprising number of people who favor some sort of benevolent dictatorship, sometimes called eco-fascism, that's going to supposedly save us from ourselves on climate change. That's a really bad idea for a lot of reasons, which I'm happy to talk about later, but I got to stick to the story here. The point is that knowing something isn't the same as acting on that knowledge. As anybody who's ever dieted, or tried to quit smoking, or start exercising, or who's lied to avoid responsibility for something knows pretty well. But there's an even bigger problem with this strategy, as Roy Scranton describes in a beautiful and really challenging little book which I recommend called Learning to Die in the Anthropocene. Here's what he writes. The problem with our response to climate change isn't changing people's minds or awareness. Everybody already knows. The problem is that the problem is too big. The problem is that different people want different things. The problem is that nobody has real answers. The problem is that the problem is us. Everybody already knows. We call people climate deniers for a reason. Built into the very notion of denial is the rejection of something obvious. Deniers know, and they refuse to acknowledge the truth. But most people, certainly I'm guessing most of you, are not deniers, at least not in this sense. But many of us are in denial about climate change. We know, but we're overwhelmed, and we often feel helpless and hopeless. And we feel that way again because the problem is a structural problem, which is another way of saying that the problem is us. It's the way we live. It's the way our economy functions. It's the fact that we're pretty deeply unsure really how to change those things or if we're willing to do it. And I think part of the appeal of personal virtue and education is that doing something, recycling or tabling or whatever, makes us feel better. But feeling better is not the same as addressing the structural issues. It's actually a way of letting us stay in denial because it lets us tell ourselves that because we're doing something, it's going to be okay. Maybe what we're doing is letting ourselves off the hook. There's another reason why I think these strategies are appealing and popular, however, especially among high-income, high-educated, predominantly white folks who have been the backbone of the mainstream conservation and environmental movement. These strategies let us avoid the messy, disagreeable, time-consuming, frustrating, and sometimes just really unpleasant world of politics. So let me recapitulate the uplifting arguments so far. We can't keep doing what we're doing. Personal virtue won't suffice. Technology is a gamble that we can ignore the real issues and still be okay. Awareness is not the problem, so education is not the answer. So maybe you're thinking, I hope you're thinking, it's time to get political. Maybe we should start signing petitions, writing polite but firm letters to the editor, and calling our elected officials. Maybe we should attend rallies if the weather is decent. This is an example of a fifth strategy that won't work, a fifth way not to save the planet, through well-mannered citizenship. Again, it's of course valuable and right to do all of those things. But it's also simply not enough, because again, the problem is structural, and well-mannered citizenship tucks neatly into the structure. I recently went to a talk by Lois Gibbs. Does anybody know who Lois Gibbs is? That name ring a bell? Lois Gibbs was a mom who became an activist when a lot of kids in her community started getting sick. And that community was the Love Canal neighborhood in Niagara Falls, New York. Gibbs talked about how her neighbors repeatedly attended community meetings, wrote letters, collected information, and shared it with the local officials and regulators, and they got ignored. And when they persisted and got heard, they were dismissed. One official actually, she said, rejected the statistics that they collected as useless housewife data, which was gathered by people with a vested interest, unlike the what you see here to my left. So Gibbs had been a real believer in the system, but she only got things done when she let go of that belief. And she summed up the point that I've been trying to make here in 4 words that have haunted me since I heard her tell her remarkable story. Polite people get poisoned. Polite people get poisoned, Gibbs said, because they try to fight a rigged system within that system's rules. We have hearings and comment periods that are designed to let you feel that you've been heard, not to hear you. We have a rigged electoral system that was originally designed to uphold slavery, is still obscenely gerrymandered, is rampant with voter suppression, and now drenched in corporate cash. Many of our elected officials are enthralled to the carbon profiteers and other big donors who benefit from this economy, which is destroying our environment, and increasingly, our politicians just are those profiteers. That big carbon knows that its product is fatal for the planet, not to mention that it's ruining our health. And they don't care. People, especially students, ask me often why they don't care. And I don't know. Maybe they think they're so rich that they'll buy their way out of the problem. Maybe their greed is so consuming that they've become deranged or actually unable to see what's happening. But whatever the case, they'll do whatever they can to prevent any meaningful action on climate change. For example, by buying up promising renewable technologies as a way of preventing them from coming online until every cent that can be made from mining and drilling has been made. And then they'll get rich again, selling us the technologies that they bought and held back once it's clear to everybody that we need them. Meanwhile, they manufacture fake scientific disagreement to promote climate denial and avoid responsibility for their products and the damage that they cause. And this message takes root in soil that's fertilized, that is covered in bullshit, by a decades-long effort to paint regulation and taxation as threats to your freedom. Now perhaps you find this hard to believe. Maybe it sounds like a conspiracy theory. No one can be that evil, you're thinking. That's exactly what they want you to think. They want to take advantage of your decency. Let me ask you if you've ever heard of another product whose salesman behaved that way. It's called tobacco. It's called DDT. It's called thalidomide. It's called Nestle Baby Formula. It's called the AR-15. It's called the subprime mortgage. It's called OxyContin. It's called the 737 MAX. You could extend that list for a very depressingly long time. I once heard Professor Bill McKibben, the founder of 350.org, which is the world's first and probably largest grassroots global climate movement, speak to a group of students and environmental activists about his journey. And he talked about how when he first began, he was really confident that if people and politicians just understood the facts about climate change and their implications, that they'd take the necessary action to avoid disaster. Eventually, he told us it slowly dawned on him that fossil fuel profiteers were in fact spending billions in this cynical and self-serving effort to disguise the truth about catastrophic climate transformation. And so what appears obvious to him now took him actually a long time to acknowledge and accept, that he was engaged not in an argument, but in a fight. And I think McKibben's story is relevant because the question isn't what arguments will help us put an end to business as usual, or what we personally can do to reduce our carbon footprints. The question isn't which technologies will save us, or how to better educate people or raise awareness. It's not whether we've written enough letters or attended enough talks like this one. The question is, how do we fight back? If well-mannered citizenship can't work in a system that's completely captured by, and let's call it by its name, genocidal corporate and financial power, what can we do to make the kind of structural changes that we need? I don't know all of the answers, and I'm curious to hear what all of you think about this. But I do think there are three things that are going to be essential to any winning strategy. First, we have to acknowledge the reality of our situation. Then we have to engage together in direct action, and we have to build solidarity. So I'll just say something briefly about each of these things in closing. So first, I think it's vital for us to face the reality of our situation. Winning this fight will not mean preventing climate change. It's too late to prevent climate change. It's already here, now, and it's going to get worse. And until very recently, the environmental movement, including most climate scientists, tried to, whistle past this particular graveyard. They tried to take an opposite strategy, to downplay the dire situation that we're in and emphasize positive messages about how there's still time to prevent things if we get our act together and do something right now. And they did so because they were afraid that hopelessness might lead people to give up. But by stressing prevention, I fear that they unwillingly enabled us to remain in denial. We've been being warned for years that the sky is about to fall, but it hasn't noticeably fallen yet. That's because climate changes are not immediate and they're uneven and they involve things like extreme swings in weather, so we still get snow and cold and terrible storms and all this stuff. And there's changing baseline syndrome and all of that stuff. And so we end up kind of coming away thinking that maybe there's still time. But if we're honest, I think this is just a way of clinging to the delusion that it might all be okay. Now, the positive approach, trying to avoid this situation, isn't crazy because hopelessness is known to be politically incapacitating. But while hopelessness is debilitating, fear isn't. It's actually a very powerful motivator. When people are afraid, they'll do a lot to eliminate the causes of their fear. Of course, hope is also a motivator, but as the science I've been touching on shows, there's not actually a lot of reason for genuine hope here. And anyway, I'm not sure there's much difference between fearing the worst and hoping to avoid it. But people need to be afraid. And we need to make them afraid, but in a way that doesn't induce despair. And the way to do that is through activism, and this is my second recommendation. Rachel Reeder wrote last year in the New Yorker that activism is a powerful antidote to the despair that fear sometimes creates. And she's right. When people get involved, they get inspired. When people join collective and creative efforts to do something, they feel energized rather than hopeless. And this actually all fits with the best social scientific evidence we have, which shows that participation is in itself empowering, and it also helps people to gain a sense of control. But I don't think just any participation will do. We need direct action. Unlike the kind of passive citizenship that I talked about earlier, direct action is disruptive. It seeks to dramatize injustice by forcing people out of their routines and making them take notice. It's also audacious. It sort of rejects these comforting stories. It sort of refuses the kind of empty expressions of concern, and it demands immediate change. Now, opponents of change also point to direct action as radical and threatening. And they're exactly right. The whole point of direct action is for it to be equal to the scale and significance of the injustice that it challenges. And that's why acknowledging the reality of our situation is so important, because it makes clear that nothing less than radical action will threaten the status quo, and that otherwise, if we don't threaten the status quo, it's not going to be enough. Now, there are a million kinds of direct action: strikes, protests, boycotts, demonstrations, occupations, civil disobedience, die-ins. One that's caught my attention that I've done some research on is today called kayaktivism. And this tactic dates back to at least the 70s, and you can see sort of the mustaches here. So you know this is an authentic photo. And back at that time, a bunch of Quakers who were opposed to Pakistani repression and genocide in East Pakistan, that's today's Bangladesh, used canoes and kayaks to blockade the freighters that were carrying U.S. weapons to the Pakistani military. And these quote-unquote naval maneuvers got a lot of media attention. You know, a bunch of people paddling around in little boats in the middle of major industrial ports is unusual, and it grabs attention. Now, by taking these kind of personal risks, the early kayaktivists demonstrated that they were really sincere. And this gave them a lot of credibility when they'd go out to local bars and talk to longshoremen, who they ultimately persuaded not to load the weapons onto the ships. And then the longshoremen, who were so moved by what the kayaktivists were doing, persuaded their national union to announce a blanket refusal to load weapons that were bound for Pakistan. And this effectively brought an end to U.S. support for that repression. There's a whole side story here about the way of breaking unions was not just an economic tactic, but also a political. Like we can go down that later if you want to also. Anyway, fast forward to 2014. There we go. 2014. When a bunch of 30 Pacific Islanders who called themselves the Pacific Climate Warriors formed a flotilla to blockade Newcastle, Australia, which is the world's largest coal port. These indigenous activists, who hailed from 12 different islands, understood the existential threat that rising sea levels posed to their peoples. Rather than passively accepting their fate, they decided to resist. So the Pacific Climate Warriors were then joined by hundreds of other activists who were inspired by their courage and conviction. And while their action couldn't ultimately prevent coal from leaving Newcastle, it did draw attention to the ongoing reliance on this filthy energy source, and it highlighted Australia's role in promoting it. In 2015, kayaktivists took to Seattle Harbor to prevent Royal Dutch Shell from sending its Arctic drilling rig Polar Pioneer to the warming waters off of Alaska, a possibility enabled by the Obama administration's conditional approval of a resumption of offshore drilling. Bill McKibben, who I mentioned a minute ago, referred to this as everyday climate denialism, Obama's decision. Anyway, while the rig did ultimately get out of port well behind schedule, Shell soon announced that it was abandoning its plans to drill in the Arctic because it lost the public relations war. As in the case of the Pacific Climate Warriors, this flotilla was successful in helping to change the discourse on responsibility for catastrophic climate transformation. Now, we're not going to save the planet by taking to the water en masse. As I hope this example illustrates, though, and as I was discussing today over at the university, the point is not only to cause disruptions, but this kind of direct action also helps to shape the discourse. It changes the conversation about climate change by forcing people to confront their assumptions, priorities, expectations, and their own behaviors. It's one part of a broader effort to create that new ethos that I was speaking about earlier. Now, I know not all of you won't be able to get in kayaks or to bid on federal oil and gas leases like Senator Christopher did, or to participate in die-ins in the state capitol up the street, or to physically block pipeline construction like the activists who opposed the Keystone XL, or the water keepers at Standing Rock, or the folks who today are blockading rail lines in Canada in support of the Wet'suwet'en people's efforts to stop the Trans Mountain Pipeline. But there's still a lot of work that all of us can do. First, you need to gratefully put up with the inconveniences that direct action causes and not complain about the traffic or how you were late for mahjong, or your haircut or whatever it was. You need to defend the protesters at dinner parties and church socials and anywhere you go. As jurors, you need to exonerate these activists regardless of what the letter of the law says, because they're taking action in self and collective defense of life as we know it. As investors and employers, we need to demand divestment. Oh, that one got up early. This is local divestment stuff happening right here in Minneapolis. We need to insist on divestment. As parents and educators, we need to congratulate and praise the millions of kids who have had the guts and the sense to go on strike. And we need to get rid of administrators and elected officials who punish or threaten them for doing it. And as we do all this stuff, we'll ourselves become more emboldened to take direct action. Now, the media and the government, at the behest of their corporate paymasters, frequently denounce climate activism as eco-terrorism. And the FBI and local police aggressively investigate climate activists as security threats while sort of looking past, neo-Nazis and white supremacists. We have to refuse these narratives. The real environmental terrorists are sitting in corporate boardrooms, at the head of the EPA, in the US Senate, and in the White House. And finally, we need to do this work in solidarity with those who stand to suffer the most. Climate change has newly awakened many white and privileged people to environmental justice issues, but the most vulnerable people in our society, impoverished and minoritized people, have been enduring the slow violence associated with environmental justice for centuries. The same carbon capitalism that brings you climate change brought them genocide, land theft, deforestation, slavery in the plantation, the pollution of air, soil, and water, and more recently, Superfund sites, cancer alleys. Again, the list could go on and on. The fight is against this structural problem that causes climate change. It's a fight against an economic system and the injustices that that system produces. Learning to see that is also part of this new ethos that I've been talking about. We have to learn to think and organize ourselves in a way that takes into account all of this injustice and sees it as part of one problem. That's, I think, our best and maybe our only chance to come to grips with climate change. And those who have been fighting the longest have a lot to teach the rest of us about what it takes to struggle and survive against such a system. So I want to stop there and open up the conversation and bring everybody in. So let me just conclude really succinctly. There are many ways not to save the planet, but really only one way to save it. By acknowledging where we really stand and taking action urgently now together. So thanks, and I look forward to the conversation. Feeling good?
So, do you have a vision of what a new economic system would look like? Because it's something I struggle with when I'm talking to people. Okay, because everybody, you because, we've grown up in this system that obviously is the best, right? And I tried to figure out how to say, it could be better. But I'm not an economist.
Yeah, it's a tough question. There's a famous quote that gets attributed to lots of different people. I've heard it attributed to Frederick Jameson, among others, but this idea that it's easier to imagine the end of the world than to imagine the end of capitalism. Because we're so in it, right? We so assume that this system is natural and that it's the way things work. And so it's really hard, actually. It's easier to imagine like the planet going down in complete climate catastrophe than to imagine a different system. So that's a challenge when we're talking to people. There's a lot I could say about that. I would refer you to the work that's done by folks at the Democracy Collaborative. If you just Google democracycollaborative.org, they've got pages of reports and studies and recommendations, everything about cooperative ownership and ways of building community wealth through public banks and green infrastructure and all kinds of things, right? So there's a lot of different ways that we already know work that could be transformative. The problem is scaling it up, right? Getting enough of that stuff happening fast enough to make a difference. But there are things we can do. And a lot of them are things, like I said, that have been proven in the past. So yeah, I think, like I said, I could get way into the weeds on specific things, which maybe isn't the best use of our time together right now.
Democracy, what was
the
it?
Democracy Collaborative.
Yeah. Thanks.
And they have a thing called the Next System Project, which is precisely about what does the next economic system look like. And I really recommend their stuff. You can sign up for their newsletter. You'll be inundated with more stuff than you ever wanted to know about all the possibilities for a different economy. But that group started at the University of Maryland, like right around when I finished grad school. So like early 2000s, and sort of evolved from a kind of more typical academic, head in the clouds kind of entity into this really cool, grounded, engaged, practical solutions operation. So I would say check them out. I will say, and I'll just throw this out there when we talk more about it, but like an idea like the Green New Deal, whatever you think of the specifics, is at least a way of trying to think comprehensively about the stuff that needs to change. Right? And I think actually the people who criticize the Green New Deal for this or that or the funding or whatever, like they're missing the point, right? The point is to shift the mindset and get us thinking really differently about possibilities. And of course the details have to be like worked out in consultation with people. Yeah, anyway, thanks. Yeah, go ahead.
I had some experience with working for Al Franken, and he won the election by less than 300 votes.
Mm-hmm.
And his vote created Obamacare in the U.S. So 269 votes changed history.
Yeah.
And just a little, maybe I'm a cranky old person, but you seem to have evaded the thought that I think you could present this to the House of Representatives as it stands. You couldn't present it at the Senate. You know how many votes flipped the Senate? 4. That's what's to do, is get the people that can do it, and we're damn close. We got Obamacare.
No, that's
by 1 vote.
No, that's right.
But I challenge you.
So, look, I spent Tuesday evening phone banking. I believe that, voting is a huge part of the work we need to do. But, when Obama was elected in 2008, he had a 60-seat filibuster-proof majority in the Senate and a big majority in the House. And they didn't even attempt climate legislation because they knew they couldn't get it passed. That was with 60 Democrats in the Senate and a Democratic-controlled House, right? Because the stuff that needs to happen is deep and structural. So yes, we got to do that work, absolutely. And we got to do a lot of other work about imagining alternative futures. I mean, I think I've agreed with precisely one thing that Pete Buttigieg ever said. But he said in one of the debates, the year to think of in terms of climate stuff is not 2040 or 2030, it's 2020. Because if the election isn't won in 2020, forget it, like we're done. So that,
But
and then all the other stuff too.
I'm sorry, we had, I think there was a man from Washington who was running with the climate as his main.
Jay
climate-
Inslee.
Jay Inslee.
Yeah.
And that's the time. Because that man and 4 other people, it's done.
But
I don't mean to be simplistic, but we're not dealing with that. That's the key. That's an opinion, and I'm shut up.
No, I mean, this is a bunch of
It's
my
a political
opinions. So you politely sat here and listened to my opinions for 30 minutes. I'm grateful to hear yours. Yeah, so we should talk about this. I don't disagree with you. I'm just not nearly as hopeful about the Democratic Party as you are with respect to their willingness to do this stuff. I mean, I live in Western Pennsylvania. We're next door to West Virginia. I know what Democrats from Appalachia think about coal and oil and natural gas and all this other stuff. And there's a lot to work on. And now there's lots of people. Go ahead, sir, and then this gentleman got.
Well, so I'll directly respond to you if that's okay.
Sure, yeah. We're just having a talk.
I vigorously disagree
Fair enough.
with that point of view. I'm pretty young, and 2 times in my life, the person who won the election didn't win the election. So the system is entirely corrupt. The Democrats are just as owned by these same groups of people as the Republicans. We cannot depend on the wealthy to save us from this disaster. And in fact, if we continue to depend on them, and we are depending on them in so many ways, we're depending on their grocery stores, we're depending on their roads, we're depending on the cars that they make for us. The entire system is a system of dependency in which we are atomized, individualized, and our power is therefore broken up and destroyed. So the longer we allow that situation to persist, the longer we allow this to continue to go on. And the only way out of that, in my view, is to band together. And, I mean, so say you have a group of children in a playground, and one of them takes 90% of the toys, and then torches everything else, which is the situation we have with grown-ups right now. You just take the toys away from the one kid, and you put them in the corner. I'm not saying we're going to kill these people, but you got to take the toys away from them. They are destroying everything. Fly over the country and look at what they've done. All the forests have been clear-cut. They are blowing up mountains, for God's sakes. Look at what they're doing in Canada right now. It's one of the largest industrial projects that's ever happened, where they're digging up. You can see it from space, where they're drilling out the oil, the tar sands, what they call it. So yeah, that's not a system that's going to get undone by whoever we elect to be president, in my view.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I would take the view that, yes, it is good to elect people who will be more inclined to consider doing the right thing and looking at real science and allowing for some action. But again, once somebody gets into that seat of power, they change, and whatever they've said before is compromised. We just had the pleasure earlier today of watching the documentary about Molly Ivins. And I don't know how many of you have seen that. The kind of hard-hitting progressive journalist from Texas who died about 10 years ago. And one of the things she talked about there is that she took shots a lot at the Republicans, but also at the Democrats and the progressives, because she said that once you're in office, the phrase she used is, you got to dance with them that took you, with them that brought you. Whoever invited you to the dance. So, whether you're Republican or Democrat or what have you, whoever's helped you with their dollars, and that's basically what they rely on to get elected. Whoever brings you there, you're going to end up having to dance with them. And I thought that was a very folksy way of describing what happens. Even when we elect the people who, when we pull the lever, really do have our good interests at heart, but can they really make the change happen?
I mean, one way to think about this is that historically we know that any kind of meaningful progressive change has happened through a combination of political leadership that was willing to be responsive, and then a much more radical group that was pushing for something completely transformative that sort of held those folks to account, right? So, if you think about the civil rights movement, it's not just the mainstream civil rights movement under Dr. King, although obviously utterly essential to the change that happened, right? It was the threat that was represented by Malcolm X and the Black Panthers and so on that helped to persuade politicians that they better change as far as they did, which wasn't enough, and there's still obviously tremendous work to do and what have you. But this dynamic of demanding radical change is actually not in tension with the goal of achieving political change, right? It's one of the conditions of possibility for political change, and we've seen that repeatedly throughout history. Sorry, you haven't had a chance yet.
Go ahead.
And then we'll come back to you. Sorry.
I was going to say that, like the IPCC report there's been a lot of emphasis on 2030. We have to fix everything in the next 10 years. Now it's 10 years. But you mentioned in your talk, and other people are talking about 2020 being like the Super Bowl of climate change because we're electing a new president. And in terms of utilities around the country, they're about to put a bunch of new natural gas power online, which is, when you look at the emissions, it ends up being about the same as coal when you take it into account the methane
leakage,
and the fracks, all the water damage that's done by fracking. Now is really the time that we have to do something about this.
No, I couldn't agree more. And my point is not don't do everything you can to influence the election. It's wake up the day after the election and keep going out in the streets, keep fighting the fight that we need to fight, right? It's not an either or, it's a both and kind of strategy.
But when it comes to like the utilities, that's an area where, engaging in the process, yes, but also, like you said, direct action. We have to
If they build this stuff, they're going to get their profit out of it.
Yeah.
And so everything that gets built, like what's the lifespan of that project? 30 years, 40 years for all these pipelines or this cracker plant they're building near us. So, Western Pennsylvania is like fracking central, right? And it turns out that something like 2/3 of our state legislature have leases with the big gas and oil companies to have fracking done on their land. So that's a good situation, right? We're going to get sound policy out of that arrangement. And now, demand for natural gas is even declining, right? Because there's an oil glut and because of like various efficiencies. So we're still emitting more stuff, but like actually the low-hanging fruit fuels are enough at the moment, and the Saudis are like pumping like crazy because they want to pump all that oil out and make all the money they can before stuff changes. So like they've always kept the taps sort of at 40 or 50%, so they would have a nice long revenue stream in the future. They've realized like we better burn all this stuff that we can now, and so like for them it's like literally putting a straw in the ground and sipping. Like it's so easy to get that oil out, and so they're pumping like crazy, which is what's putting coal out of business, which is the worst thing ever, and what's also putting actually fracking. Natural gas is even under threat, right? So then what are they doing in Pittsburgh? So now they're building an ethylene cracker plant, which is basically they make these little pellets out of ethylene, which is one of the byproducts of natural gas drilling. And that's what they use to make single-use plastics, those grocery bags that are so gross, and like plastic forks and all that stuff, the bottles that we use and everything else, right? So they're just gonna use the gas for that, and it's super cheap now. They can get it for cheap. That means that your plastic. So it's a big systemic challenge. That's why I said ultimately, like it's not just about we gotta. I don't know how to exactly do this, but we gotta change the way we live and the way we think about how we live, and that's comprehensive. Go ahead and then. Yeah.
So I've done some lobbying of
Thank you.
members of Congress in Tina Smith's office and Amy Klobuchar's office. And, these are Democrats. And they don't get it. They're not leading any charge on climate. And I heard someone say recently, I can't remember who it was, somebody said recently that most of the people who are members of Congress are not leaders, they're followers. And so you can't depend on them to lead the way out of power.
The chief county executive of Allegheny County, which is where Pittsburgh is located, is a guy called Rich Fitzgerald. And when the most recent report came out about Pittsburgh having all Fs on its air quality for like the umpteenth million year in a row, like since the beginning of these ratings, all Fs, right? And actually it's so bad that there's now an app called Smell Pittsburgh, where like you can log in and like say like it smells like rotten eggs where I am right now, and they track this with like weather patterns and whatever, so you can actually tell where the pollution is moving around the air. So anyway, this all Fs report comes out, and Fitzgerald gives a press conference and he says, you know, all these people are complaining about the air and the way it smells. To me, it smells like jobs. So that was his response. It smells like jobs. I have nothing else to say. Actually, I have a lot more to say about that, as you can probably imagine.
Just recently, I had the thought that we're progressing down the road of converting to electric travel. Everywhere except the very southernmost states in the US and Canada depends on oil or gas for heating homes and buildings. When do we change that?
Yeah, there's a lot to do. Go ahead.
Well, so St. Paul has a climate action plan, and one of the things we're going to start with here is the climate chart. Ask him about, well, what about building codes? You know, because if you say no gas, then people have to go electric on their stoves and their everything. And that's a state thing.
But
Was working on it at the state, and then there are a couple of people, but you know it's not going through the Senate, the state Senate.
But how many of these codes that they pass are retroactive for all the buildings that exist today?
Well, and how are you going to help people who don't have money to replace what they have?
Again, okay.
Well, so one of the things that I think you brought up was the first thing. What was the first principle?
Business as usual?
No,
Second one, personal virtue.
The way forward. It's
Oh, the way forward. We have to acknowledge the reality of our
yeah,
situation.
accept the reality of our situation. So I don't even like climate change as a branding for this. What we're talking about is ecological collapse.
Yeah.
Ecological collapse. And so the question is not how are we going to change to electric, it's are we going to have resources with which to survive in 10, 20, 30 years, depending on how these things progress and how they happen. And even if we are privileged enough to have the resources, who are we actually cutting out? Because like, if say half of global farming goes down, who are we going to choose to feed? And who's going to make those choices? That's the actual question. And so we got to stop doing 90% of what we do, basically, and keep 100% of people as best as we can alive. That's the thread that we're trying to needle, okay? Or needle the thread, rather.
Yeah.
So that if that's really the issue, if that's what we're talking about, what do you recommend? To stop doing 90% of what we're doing and keep 100% of people alive, and keep people on dialysis alive.
Well, when you change the whole business of farming, when you change the whole business of heating and travel, you've made a good start.
And so part of that work, and part of what I like about the idea, if the Green New Deal upsets you, like call it carrot soup, I don't care what you call it, but a program that thinks systematically about change views those kinds of challenges not as obstacles, but as opportunities to put people to work, to really make rapid kinds of change, to make the investments that we need. We could spend a little less than $787 billion a year on our military, and invest some of that in something like the future viability of life on the planet. Just, to take one example, right? So, I know, right? It seems crazy. So it's not that it can't be done, I think. I mean, look, and this is the other thing. Let's forget about, I mean, yes, obviously, like, Super Bowl, yes, you're absolutely right. You're absolutely, like, for this and every other reason, like, we need to have a different outcome in November of this year than we had the last time around, right? Like, for every reason. So that. But also, right, forget about, like, this is not about stopping or preventing climate change at this point, right? This is about how are we going to adapt and deal with the catastrophic transformations that are already baked in based on what we've already done. And we can do better or worse on that, right? And it matters whether we do better or worse on that. But if we stop thinking in terms of there's a deadline, or it's this or that, or now, or we may as well not, or whatever else, let's just start thinking about, like, the sooner we invest in this stuff, the better off everybody is, and the longer we wait, the worse off we all are, and the even more tragic the trade-offs become, like, the better off we're going to be. Yeah.
Oh, I could say something.
Oh, I thought, sorry. Just brush me. Well, now you've got the mic, so you might.
I might as well use it now. I was thinking that it just occurred to me that part of the ruling class, or what I fear about the ruling class, is they're betting on their hold on power to be the people who are going to survive whatever's going to happen. And so they have an interest in maintaining the status quo as long as possible and get, all this radical disasters happen, and they're able to encapsulate themselves and insulate themselves from the effects, and everyone else is left to suffer a really horrible end.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of.
I would say that.
No, I think there's a lot of. I think there's a lot of that callousness. I really do. Like, there is a kind of. Yes. But also, there is just a lot of being in denial. I was talking to some folks recently who study transportation networks and urban planning stuff in Florida. And I found out, like, to my amazement, the state of Florida is about to invest $150 billion in building a high-speed rail link from Orlando to Miami. This will be underwater in 20 years, probably before it's done. So they're willing to spend $150 to build an underwater train, but the state has forbidden the use of the word climate change in any official documents relating to environmental policy or anything else, right? They've just banned it. Well, if we just, just do this, everything will be fine. Like, evil plus insanity equals really bad outcomes, right? I can't stress that enough. And so we have to fight the evil and the insanity at the same time. That's a lot.
I don't understand when banks make money available for projects like that, or people just building on the coast. And I don't understand why insurance companies insure.
So this is one of the big arguments made by the divestment movement, right? The stranded assets theory, like, you can't keep lending money to these people on the projection that they're going to make profits in the future on the basis of known oil reserves or pipeline, because eventually there will come a time when we stop this, and then that stuff is all worthless. And so you really ought to stop. But there's sort of two things. One is your point. Well, like, maybe we don't ever actually stop. Maybe the collective non-decision is just, we just keep emitting, and we deal with the consequences, and whoever the we is in this sentence assumes that we're privileged enough that we'll be okay, and if a bunch of people die, like, that'll help the situation because there'll be less emissions. Like, maybe that's the thinking, I don't know. But it's a big problem. And this stranded asset theory, like, it makes sense on paper. But then you try and, like, there's a bunch of students at my university right now, way to go fossil-free pitch, shout out to you guys, camped out in the main academic building on our campus, trying to get the administration to like divest from fossil fuels, right? This is Pittsburgh. And, you know, there's a lot of carbon money still clanking around in Pittsburgh. And, you know, they're talking about socially responsible investing, and we're going to be carbon neutral by, there's just an email there, we're going to be carbon neutral by 2037 or something. The university is going to be carbon neutral by 2037. Okay, sure.
Seems just far enough out not to achieve it.
Right, well, it's going to coincide with the 250th anniversary of Pitt's founding. So there you go. Never mind like that, yeah.
So even in a state like Minnesota where we don't have any fossil fuel stuff happening, we don't have fracking, we don't have coal mining, the largest lobbyist in Minnesota by a factor of 10 is Enbridge. Because they want to build this pipeline through our state. It's not even going to do anything in our state, it's just going to pass through our.
It's going to create jobs, that's what they're telling people.
Yeah.
But
A couple of jobs for a couple of years while they build the damn thing.
It's not just the lobbying, it's also the counties up north depend on the taxes that they get from Enbridge for those pipelines. And if you travel around up north, like all the little hockey rinks have Enbridge sponsorship, and so the communities up there have become dependent on that money. And so the inequality, like just the huge amount of wealth is itself very corrosive and hard to overcome. And the second largest lobbyist in the state of Minnesota is XL Energy. And when we started asking the St. Paul City Council about, you know, how does energy work in our city, they said, well, let me call the XL lobbyists and set you up. So that's the degree of regulatory capture that we're dealing with. When it comes to energy, it's these corporations that are controlling things, and they're not local, they're not even American in a lot of cases. So that's kind of what we're up against.
Yeah, good.
What I fear is that what has to really happen is the kind of activism where you have to lay your life on the line. And people are doing that, and of course, and have done that for years. But, you know, the masses follow and just continue to do whatever. And it's, I don't know, and however we can be activated to stand up and like take a fork and stab it in the balloon, but people have died, and that's the kind of activism that probably has to happen.
That's absolutely, and here's the thing, and I don't say this lightly, and I don't mean to. I have a lot of work to do myself on this front. People like us in this room have a lot of privilege. We are the least at risk when we go out and sit in or chain ourselves to something or whatever, because we're going to get treated better than other people who might do this work are going to get treated. And we got to use that privilege, right? We got to use that privilege, because everything's on the line, or you know, or not. But then that's a choice, and we have to understand it as such. Yes, sir.
Just a note on the survivors of this. How many people are going to survive when 6 months of the year the high every day is 130 degrees? And how much farming is going to survive at those temperatures? And we have a real possibility of getting there. When the Arctic and Antarctic glaciers melt in Greenland, that's just going to go poof on the temperature scale. Also the permafrost.
Yeah, no, all these things are huge problems, and it's not just that we have a real chance of getting there. It's that we have a slim chance of not getting there.
Right.
Right. That's the reality. So a thing I've been doing, like if this is really depressing for you, like it's really depressing for me too. Like, I don't love like having to be doing this work. But like a thing that has helped me a lot is that partly for other reasons, partly in connection with this, like I've taken up a meditation practice to just try to learn to like sit with the way things are and understand what I can and can't do, and to like be able to not get paralyzed by that fear and hopelessness, and actually just try to do what I can. So, you know, whatever that looks like for you in your life, I don't know, and I'm not here to tell you how you should organize your life, but for me, there's always that problem of how do you avoid that despair, you know, and how do you find the work energizing and hopeful, and you know, and for me, partly, honestly, it's coming out and talking with folks like you and hearing about what you're thinking about and your ideas, and trying to like just be in community with people who care about these things. I mean, that's a big part of the work. That's not enough, but that's part of it. So we got to do that. Yes, ma'am.
The thing that's motivating, I think, most for me is that as I get old, and I am old, I understand my mortality. So it's really about our children. You know, it isn't. I mean, we put our lives on the line. So what? You know, at least for me. Well, not for a young guy, but for as we age, it's like so.
So maybe we ought to be doing that. I mean, really, when I think about the complacency, when I was young and the things I did, I don't do so much now. Really, I don't. And I'm tired. I'm really flippin' tired when I work all day because I'm getting old, or we're old. So, but then really that's maybe perhaps the time to say it. So I'm serious. It's really, you know all the people in history that have literally died to make life good for the larger community. And to think about putting your life on the line is really horrible. And then there's I don't know, like how to knock myself out of like the fatigue to go or do. And when I was younger, I would do things much more. And I think, well, there's the young people. Well, yeah, well, okay, so maybe, I don't know.
Well, you know, and I really appreciate these comments, and I just want to be completely clear. Part of the reason I wrote this talk, and I try to give this talk when I have the chance, is not because I want to depress people, and not because I want to like put people down for the stuff that they're trying to do. That's not it. It's about like realizing that there's really one thing we can do, right? And I think somehow the clarity about that, like realizing that, you know, okay, so here I've got my reusable water bottle with its important social justice slogan, right? So it's all good here. But you know, whether I have that or I have a plastic bottle of water, like, is not the thing. And we've been so conditioned to beat ourselves up every time, like, we buy a coffee to go, which is just like the wrong level of consciousness and engagement to be thinking about this stuff, right? Of course, like, take a reusable coffee cup. I do. I have bamboo silverware in my briefcase. Like, the point is not don't do this stuff. The point
What
is,
about saving rubber bands off of broccoli?
yes, like, yes, they're great for closing up a catheter, which you can then put in the, right, it's all, yes. Right? But again, like, you can go down these rabbit holes of like, how do I manage my, like, should I wash out my plastic bags, which puts detergent in the water, or should I throw it away, or should I try and use that beeswax wrappy stuff, which like has to be produced, like,
This is where the meditation comes in.
this is where the meditation comes in, and this is where recognizing that the problem is a structural problem comes in, right? It's the system, it's capitalism, it's like the carbon economy. We gotta take this on, like, directly. And so recognizing that that's really the thing and not all this other stuff, to me, is like clarifying, I hope, and helps to focus on what needs to be done. Go ahead, thanks.
It's going to happen. So we're either going to go into it with our eyes open, or we're going to go into it blind with denial. It's going to happen. So you have to be awake.
So I want to come back to where I started, that here we are on a Friday night, and we're all out, trying to learn something, make community with each other, whether we thought of that as an intention of what we're doing or not. I think that your points about being active and being active in solidarity, and when, I did a lot of stuff when I was younger too, but I think that it's not that we're tired. If we did things with people, we would get more energy from doing things with people. It's not a zero-sum thing that we're going to run out of energy. It's by doing things with other people. And none of those, it's always tempting when we're around somebody who has done a lot of research and analysis to think that there's that one complete answer that we're looking for. And we're going to stumble towards an answer by being in some sort of motion in connection with each other. And we'll make some mistakes, and we'll have some terrible disappointments, and maybe some people will make enormous sacrifices, but it's being in there to be in that relationship with each other and trying to move forward beyond the individual choices of the water bottles and so on. So I think I would feel terrible if we left here tonight less hopeful than we had come here, because we've heard a great talk and we've met a bunch of people that we may not have known before who are here for the same reason that we're here. And I don't mean to stop the conversation, but I want to try to shift the energy a little bit. And I know two people spoke to me when they came in about things that are coming up that they'd like to tell other people about it. So, Lisa, do you want to say something about it?
I could,
Please.
unless there are more things.
Please.
Well, before I say what's coming up, I do want to ask you though, because you're sort of preaching to the choir right now,
Absolutely.
but do you give a lot of talks where you get a lot of pushback and people don't believe you, or they accuse you of making stuff up, or?
But the very nature of these things is you end up preaching to a lot of choirs, right? And so as you intuited, part of the way the talk is constructed is to get the choir a little uncomfortable. And so that's part of it. Where I find more resistance is in bars, actually. Like I try to, so I say that for, noble social activism and research purposes, I like to hang out in bars and talk about politics. I actually just like to hang out in bars and talk about politics anyway. But you get pushback, but part of what's so valuable about that kind of pushback is that that's where you really learn what the issues are and where you really have to work to understand where people are coming from. So, we had some public hearings in Pittsburgh about I don't remember anymore. There's a lot of hearings and a lot of comment periods, and you show up and for one of them, they really brought out the coal miners. Like they just, busloads of coal miners were brought in to give the opposite point of view, right? And so you can either stand there and shout at the coal miners and they'll shout back at you, and then maybe you feel better about that, or maybe you feel worse or whatever. Or you can talk to the coal miners and you find out that what they're really worried about is this is how they make their living. And if not for this, no health care for their families, no income, no obvious alternatives on the horizon, right? And that's part of it. That's that point about them making people precarious, so that it's worse to think about stopping burning coal than it is somehow to think about the radical devastation that's coming as a result of this way we're living. And so, so that's a real thing. You have to engage with those people, and that's why I think, again, I sound a little bit like I'm here to promote the Green New Deal, and maybe I am, and that's fine, but that kind of, even if it's not perfect, that way of thinking about trying to be, realizing that it's not just stop all emissions now, and may the heavens fall. It's, you gotta pay attention to real people's lives and experiences and stop emitting now in a way that doesn't, so people talk about just transition and all this kind of stuff, and that's super important for just those reasons, right? So, I get pushback, and I get pushback in class and whatever, but actually, the point I made about denial, that it's the refusal to acknowledge something that everybody knows and that is obvious, actually is really helpful here. Because people actually do know. People know. And if they sit there and tell you it's a Chinese hoax, or, that it's all made up, or that Elon Musk is going to fix it for us or whatever before he rockets off to Mars and starts his next set of adventures or whatever, then to me the question becomes, why are they having that reaction? Like, what's the thing they're scared or afraid or upset or invested in or whatever it is? And then then you can work on that, right? So yeah, I do get some, but
But people are very afraid of change, and they wait until it's kind of an emergency or, but I think.
Which
Great.
which it is.
It is.
Yeah.
So, well, that brings
So please,
me.
yeah, make your announcement.
Yeah, I'll just say, so I have some flyers that anyone can pick up, but I'm on the St. Anthony Park Community Council Environment Committee, and if you're familiar with where 280 and Kasota, that whole Kasota Pond area, our neighborhood has been working on those ponds for like 30 years to get them cleaned up and get birds flying over, and they actually support wildlife, and it's a remaining wetland. Well, there's a company that wants to build a parking lot for trailer trucks that will be going in and out right by the 280 one of the ramps, and it will definitely affect the ponds adversely. And it's also about 20 feet of ash dump and mercury and lead and hospital waste and everything. And so about 20 years ago, BP wanted to build a gas station, and the neighborhood said, no, you can't, or, all up in arms. So I've been going door to door, getting people to sign petitions. So we do have an appeal, but they did give a permit for this company.
Who gave them?
The city.
The city.
Is that Minneapolis or St. Paul?
St. Paul, and it's Roan Industry, and the irony is Roan Industry is a great company, it's a recycling company, but they just should not be parking their trucks in this particular piece of land. So, it's going to be really hazardous when they start digging to put the cement down. It's going to emit a lot of toxins in the air, and they haven't done enough soil samples, and anyway, on the committee there are a lot of scientists from the U of M and everything. I don't know all the science behind it, but I do know that it'll open a large can of worms, and not to mention traffic problems and ruin the ponds that are there. So anyway, there's a hearing on Wednesday, so you can go to City Hall. It's at 5:30. And also, what would be extremely helpful, and there are flyers here and I can give anyone, is to make a comment on the city file, because the city council will have packets, and if they have people in opposition, then they can read that. Then they say, oh, we're elected officials, and if people don't want this parking thing here, then. So anyway, I would appreciate, if you can't go to the hearing, I understand, but if you do, wear green, like you have green on. But a comment online would be so helpful. So thank you.
Where are you going to put this?
Pardon?
Could I?
Yeah, I've got plenty. Yep.
In Chelsea?
Just pass them out like you're teaching.
Yeah.
I'm the St. Paul organizer for 350, and we have, Xcel Energy is in the middle of its current resource plan, and one of the things they're proposing is a new natural gas power plant. And so during the comment period, and I'm being polite right now, but...
Sure, no, go ahead.
So during the comment, well, we have an opportunity to comment on their resource plan. One of the things that we did is we got the city of St. Paul to sign a resolution saying that as a city, we are going to advocate for our clean energy goals and oppose any new fossil fuel infrastructure. So the city of St. Paul is going to comment on their resource plan. And then our 350 group is going to kind of do a people's comment that we're also going to submit. And one of the things we want to include in that comment is as many people as we possibly can. So we have a pledge card that we are giving to everybody. If you live in St. Paul, you can sign our card. And one of the ways we came up with this campaign is some of the things we're learning at the Freedom Library about union organizing and structure tests. We're not doing this in a workplace, but we're trying to organize our community. And so this is a way for us to see who's out there, who cares about this, what allies do we have. so that when we're ready to go to the next level, to escalate, whatever the circumstances warrant, then we know who to call. So if you live in St. Paul, please sign our card. And I have a lot more information if you want it.
And can I just say, I'm here because of you, because I mailed back that, and we had that phone conversation, and then I got the email about this event. So, yeah.
What's the deadline for the comments?
The comment period, actually, this is kind of good news. The Public Utilities Commission sent them back to remodel their plan. And they said, redo this because they questioned some of their numbers. So it's already been kicked back once, and they're going to release their updated plan on April 1st, we'll say.
Yeah.
And then we have until August 3rd is the end of the comment period. So besides the pledge cards, we're also trying to mobilize other groups to comment on their plan and have our say. So the commitment on the pledge card, I should mention that too, is I stand for powering St. Paul with 100% clean renewable energy for everyone and no new fossil fuel infrastructure. That's the plan.
What if you don't live in St. Paul?
Then, do you live in Minneapolis? Well, then maybe you should get something going there. Oh, and one reason we're organizing as a city is Minneapolis has already been, they have a pretty good, they have some good tension with Xcel. We don't have that yet in St. Paul, but St. Paul is actually a bigger customer for Xcel Energy because we get both of our electricity and our gas from them. So they're paying very close attention to our city, which for the first time we're starting to give them some pushback. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, but I don't have something like that to share, but I have another question though, if there's
Sure,
time.
let's take this one and then we'll break up, and then I'm happy to stick around and chat with anybody
And
who
it was
wants
kind
to.
of prompted by what we were just hearing, but also other things that were running through my mind. In talking about climate change and the different things that go on in industry and what's worsening the climate. It's part of our whole environmental degradation, and there are other things that I don't necessarily know that they are prompting climate change, like pesticide use and water quality issues and such like that. And and I know different people who are focused on different issues that and they're all important. But what do you see as a synergy that connects those, or is the climate that's the existential threat that we really need to focus on, or?
Yes. there's a lot of synergies. We got to focus on climate, but I think if we focus just on climate and emissions without taking all the other environmental injustices into account, we tie one hand behind our backs. And we also just don't deal comprehensively with the nature of this sort of systemic problem. One of the nice things is saving ponds or protecting a stream or a chunk of forest that you care about or whatever it might be is almost for sure likely also to have good effects in terms